Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. This is about the Vision Zero was mentioned. We've been focusing around safety, as you know, both with driving change and then the recent Office of Highway Safety grant for pedestrians. And our goal when we do any of this work is to improve street safety and quality of life in all of our neighborhoods and build awareness about dangerous moving violations like failing to yield or stop to pedestrians, new street designs and configurations to improve safety, broad public outreach and communications, and then make legislative changes where necessary. And as we've been doing this work, you may recall last year we amended the rules, 2 years ago now, before we did the driving change campaign, we amended rules to make sure that we were had the most up-to-date requirements and what our goals were. In December, you adopted the Vital Streets Plan, and there were a number of measures of success that were identified, but the first of those was traffic-related serious injuries and fatalities and reducing those, which is the Vision Zero, kind of the basis of that. And so we are been measuring those crashes involving pedestrians, involving cyclists, doing that messaging, and really taking that very seriously. And in the values of the Vital Streets Plan, we identified 6 core values with our working groups from the Vital Streets work. Mode share and shifting mode share was one of those. Equity, Vision Zero, eliminating all traffic-related serious injuries and fatalities on Grand Rapids City streets. Health, age-friendly, and climate change were also identified. But the idea of Vision Zero, and so this work that I'm presenting to you today really carries that Vision Zero piece forward and starts to expand on that. As you can tell, the topic of transportation is massive, and there's all these different components in working together, and how do we put these things together? So when we talk about Vision Zero, we talk about traffic crashes that are not mere accidents. So it's not a traffic accident. These things can be prevented and can be systematically addressed. In the 1990s in Sweden, it's when it was first started and has really spread around the country. In major cities, we're seeing it being adopted all over, and MDOT has also adopted, it's not Vision Zero, they call it zero deaths, but they have other work that they've been advancing. And so when we look at Vision Zero, we look at the data and the methodology. We use that education, enforcement, engineering that Kristen had mentioned for bikes. We also look at kind of the severity of those crashes and what that means. When you talk about someone who's injured and the severity of that injury, that can significantly impact someone's quality of life, their earning ability, their families, and so that severity of the crash is also very, very important. Coming out of the Vital Streets Plan adoption in December, we just finished this fall our Vital Streets Design Guidelines. This is a staff working document, so it's not something that was approved by the City Commission, but the Vital Streets Design Guide really sets the parameters for city staff when we're designing facilities on what we need to be thinking about. So there's 2 key principles that we have in the design guidelines. It's a nice thick book, but all streets should be safe and accessible for all users, and streets should be logical and intuitive to use. So we are guiding people through design on how they should behave and how that interaction happens on the street so that people know intuitively where they're supposed to be. We're trying to avoid confusion and just make it as simple as it can, which provides that safety. There's several design choices when we're looking at how we design our streets. We look at the vehicle design speed, the design vehicle and control vehicle, operational performance measures, the peak period and forecast year, kind of what are the trends for the facility, and then the all users in their experiences. So when we developed the design guide, it was with these metrics in mind, and in particular speed. When we talk about speed, the odds of a pedestrian being killed or a cyclist being killed increases significantly the faster the automobile goes. So you have a 12% of pedestrian fatality if they're traveling 25 miles per hour. That goes up to almost 50%, so 45% chance of pedestrian fatality at 40 miles per hour. If you look at former engineering standards and how conventional street design has been, those bubbles on the top, the conventional street design line, we might post it for 25 miles per hour. Well, engineering will say, well, then the design speed is actually 5 miles over that, so we design it at 30 miles per hour. But the actual reality when people are out there driving is that they're usually going faster than the 30 miles per hour. And so we might see them going 40 miles per hour. Versus when we do context-sensitive design, design and the design approach that we're intending to do for all of our streets, and we have been doing actually. When you look at some of the new designs we have for Vital Streets, we're trying to take all of that, both the design speed, the posted speed, and what that actual driver will be driving, and take that to 25 miles per hour. And so that does cause a little bit of angst. We've had a lot of discussions about Burton Street, where we did the road diet, but we lessened the speed from the average speed from almost 40 miles per hour down to, well, it was 39 miles per hour down to 25. So we've reduced the speed on there. We've reduced the number of speeding tickets by 90% along that street. And the percent of severe and fatal crashes, we didn't have any fatal crashes, so severe crashes was down by 2/3. So we can do this. There's a number of policy recommendations that we're making, both for resolutions, policies, and ordinances that I'm presenting. So you have a table that's in front of you. The first one is that we adopt a Vision Zero resolution, very similar to the Complete Streets resolution that we adopted a number of years ago. It really sets the framework for city staff in guiding this work and kind of makes that kind of the statement that we need to construct all these policies around it. So it would demonstrate that commitment and really focus on the safety of all users on the streets. And it also complements the work that we've been doing with driving change and the Office of Highway Safety Planning for our education and enforcement efforts to improve the safety for pedestrians and bicyclists on our streets. So the first piece is that resolution that really serves as the umbrella for all of these other resolutions. The second piece would be amending Chapter 51 of Streets, similar to what you did with no parking in a bike lane a couple of years ago. We don't have anything that says no parking in a transit stop. So it's pretty easy. So this one is, I think, an easy one, but it will affect parking spaces, and we have to go through that analysis about how many parking spaces. But as we're looking at the transit stops in association with the transit shelter program that Kristen's working on, we have to kind of rethink all this anyway. So we were making that recommendation. The third recommendation would be to look at development projects using right-of-way that are blocking pedestrian and bicycle access. We've heard a lot of recent complaints, and I think part of that is because of the amount of construction activity that we have going on in downtown and the neighborhoods, and the size of these projects. We don't have little tiny projects anymore. We're having owned private development projects now building their own parking ramps to support their project. That's new. We're seeing larger blocks being developed. And so that has come with a lot of concern as we have more people biking and walking in the community about these obstructions and safety and being forced to cross the street. So I've got a couple examples of where we've heard this and a couple issues that are arising from it. So this is 50 Monroe, where because they're taking off the face of that building, it's all, but when we run into Art Prize and how do you get people to cross, we did some flexible delineators in the street and had people cross and had a police officer stationed there, but how do we make sure that there's regular clearance? And on the right, you can see a gentleman actually walking in the street. This is the Embassy Suites project in North Monroe. Both the bike lane and the sidewalk are completely taken out, and so there's a detour that is, that's supposed to be posted, but we don't really see that in this picture. This is the Warner Tower that's at Pearl and Ottawa. And in some cases, the right-of-way is being used for parking, it's being used for other things and not for pedestrian clearance, or we need to figure out how to fit those in. We hear oftentimes in bigger cities they figured it out, like Chicago and New York. We can do it too. So we want to amend the ordinance to allow this, to make sure that we're very clear and change the default so that it will be provided unless there's other extenuating circumstances where we can't provide that access. The fourth recommendation is improved temporary occupancy permit enforcement abilities. Right now, we do not have in the omnibus fee schedule thing for ticketing for violations. So when John Hayes goes out or our LUDS inspectors, when they go out and they're inspecting a site, they might see dumpsters. This is an example in the street, but we have other examples of dumpsters in rights-of-way and cross sidewalks and other locations where we need a better way to kind of do enforcement, and so that's always part of the activities that we look to. The fifth regulation change that we'd be recommending to you is changing yield to stop. So both Traverse City and Ann Arbor have stop rules for pedestrians when pedestrian is in or entering into the crosswalk. So rather than yield, which is more permissive, they encourage people to stop fully if someone is in the crosswalk so that they can go through. So we have that ordinance recommendation. And finally, trying to measure safety with the amenities that the community wants and the aesthetics that the community wants. So we've had a lot of discussions about increasing awareness that people live here, having some of the sensitivity regarding placemaking that the neighborhoods want. We've heard a lot of different things. And so this last recommendation is kind of broken into three parts regarding art in local streets. The City Commission Arts Advisory Committee has a policy about things in our public areas and how we view that. We want to combine that with some other changes, but these are policy changes. And so when we looked at that, we reviewed both the Michigan Uniform Traffic Control Device standards as well as federal guidance, and we worked with the Attorney's Office on what would be feasible and allowable within that area, taking into consideration that guidance and those requirements as well as the types of streets that we're talking about. So this first recommendation would allow decorative painting on local streets. So when we talk about local streets, that's about 2/3, 3/4 of our streets. So these are not major streets where we use state or federal funds for to improve those streets. These are local neighborhood streets with an average daily traffic below 4,000 cars a day. And the federal guidance does allow for street art and intersection murals. So you could do art in travel lanes and medians, but the goal is to not have them interfere with any traffic control devices. A crosswalk is a traffic control device, and so we want to avoid the crosswalk, but there are examples where this has been done really well, and you can see where they're outside of the crosswalk area, but they still can do the art in the streets, in the intersections. Again, to raise awareness, and there's some assertion that it helps, do traffic calming, but certainly from a placemaking standpoint, there's no data that we have that says, this slows down cars from a safety perspective. But we do recognize that there's aesthetic and kind of community considerations that people want to see this type of improvement in their neighborhood. So we want to figure out ways to allow it. So the first one would be looking at these intersections and medians, this dead space that we might have in city streets where it's not interfering with those traffic control devices to allow that type of activity. The second recommendation would address the crosswalk painting or crosswalk enhancements. We found examples that both comply with MUTCD language and federal highway guidance. The language, though, is not kind of everything everywhere. I pulled the most salient piece from the language from the federal guidance. Subdued colored aesthetic treatments between the legally marked transverse crosswalk lines are permissible. Elements, pattern, and color for these treatments are to be uniform, consistent, repetitive, and expected, so as not to be a source of distraction. No element of aesthetic interior treatment can implement pictographs, symbols, multiple color arrangements, etc., or can otherwise attempt to communicate to any roadway user. And they go on to describe colors and some different things, but there are treatments like this one in Traverse City where they took the subdued colors, they did some patterning, they did something different than would be a normal, traditional, just white crosswalk. We have piano keys that has that uniformity and consistency in color that would also be allowed. That was done in Kalamazoo. The picture on the left, if you go to Indianapolis and you see the cultural trail, they've used this patterning with the consistency, and then you have the blocks as designs. So there are some creative approaches, but also still fall within that federal guidance and the MUTC guidelines. So that consistency, the expectations, without going too far outside of those boundaries is something that we could consider from a policy standpoint. And then finally, and here's the example that Chris L worked with Williams and works with Lene Wells on. Again, as was a demonstration project, but looking again that consistency and pattern with the waves and color were something that was taken into consideration as they were identifying this as a potential pilot. The final one is looking at how to respond to other facilities within the public right-of-way, including sidewalks, sign cabinets, and light poles. Again, can't appear to be a traffic control device, but looking at other types of painting in the right-of-way where it's allowed. And examples, there's these really cool examples that are out there of rain markings. So there's a marking on a sidewalk, but you don't see it until it gets wet. So there's some innovative things that are out there. This is from Ann Arbor. This guy goes around and paints little things on sidewalks. But then you also have decorative cabinets. The one on the left is from Detroit when they were having the Transformers movie. But then you also have different painting, and of course we've got Reb's artwork all over. So that type of thing, we don't have a formal policy right now addressing it. It's been pretty permissive, but we do want to recognize, especially with working with the Arts Advisory Committee, that there is a place for art, but that work, we also have to recognize there's potential pitfalls regarding maintenance and messaging and what those things are. So we want to make sure that's a little bit more formalized in our approach. The timeline for this, we're talking about this today. If you are amenable to these recommendations, then we would bring it forward to you both to adopt the Vision Zero resolution, to modify the city policies, which could be done without a hearing, or if you want a hearing for that, we could also do that. It'd be a first reading for the ordinances and then to set the hearing. We would have a public hearing on the 28th of November, and then on the December 12th, we could adopt the ordinances. Again, it's up to the commission as to whether or not you'd want a public hearing, but anticipating that you might, I worked that into the timeline.
Great, thank you. All right, questions, commissioners?
Yeah, thank you for this. I really like the format. It's easy to read, very simple. You talked about local streets being less than 4,000 a year. Cars per day, excuse me. So the decorative treatment in crosswalks has been probably the thing I've heard most about. So I would recommend a public hearing and to make sure that we get out to the neighborhoods what those policies will look like so that they can make comments. Sure. Because, I think about streets like Alger in the 3rd Ward, Leonard, in these business corridors, the SID areas, and Plainfield's one in the 2nd Ward, trying to figure out how to manage traffic in those areas. I know they're not local streets with a small numbers, they're very large numbers, and yet there are real safety concerns in sections of those that are within the very busy business districts. So just to better understand what this policy might mean and get some feedback would be helpful. And also what what the state says we can and cannot do, and if those are written in stone. What can we do locally? I know Ann Arbor's got an ordinance that moved away from some of the state guidelines, so what can we do locally?
I think it's what you're comfortable with, and certainly the city attorney has weighed in on that and regarding the federal guidance. So we can certainly provide the federal guidance to you for review, just so you're familiar with that, and we may need additional weighing in from Anita.
Okay, thank you. Very helpful.
Yeah. I asked the same question, Commissioner, and we see them all over in other cities, and I know there's issues that have been brought up about the federal guidelines and liability. So I'm really curious, about other cities, and quite frankly, if any city has ever been sued for doing something creative in their crosswalks. So I think having a little bit more time to look into that, I think, is a good idea. But from this body, it sounds like we need a little bit of direction to determine if we want to go with this proposed timeline. Sounds like Commissioner Kelly would like a public hearing. I'm supportive of that. Is everyone supportive in giving the green light to move forward with bringing back some of these resolutions to the full commission? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes, okay. My only other question, and I think this is probably maybe more for Greg, so having just had the bicycle presentation done by Kristen and then this one, I'm curious about just having this be led by the planning department instead of the mobility department, especially now with the restructuring of our mobile GR committee. It seems like it's a better fit with the mobility department. But I'm just curious, structure-wise, have there been conversations about that?
You can be sure that Josh has been involved in both of these processes.
Okay. I mean, Commissioner, you serve on that. It just seems.
Well, there's a definite overlap here. So, but I know you meet together in design committee. But I think to have both present in answering questions and involved in this would be very helpful because yes. there's so much overlap, and Mobile GR has taken on these other modes of transportation and advancing them that clearly have impact with these revisions. So,
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at like issues around transit and parking spaces and bike lanes, and it just seems like,
If I could add a little perspective.
yeah, that would be helpful.
Okay, I'd be glad to. So these recommendations come to you from the combined design team, which includes Mobile GR, Chris Saul, Rick DeVries, Suzanne Schultz, Kristen Bennett, and they've also been reviewed by the Vital Streets Oversight Commission. So it's the same family, essentially, that brought you Sustainable Streets, it brought you Vital Streets, and brought you the bicycle progress that we've made so far. So while Suzanne is the messenger today, there was a team process. She was basically nominated to be messenger because people were elsewhere. So this is about the team approach to getting this done and making sure that we have a comprehensive recommendation. So everybody was included and had a role in making these recommendations and getting to this point.
Okay, great. Good
thanks.
to know.
just one more thing. I think that's great to have that team process because you're all, impacting this. But I have had some conversations with Josh too and others about the process itself. And I know just as commissioners, we hear from neighborhood groups about these things, and sometimes they don't know, how do you funnel this through? So can we improve that process itself that, I'm sure you all want to do and are probably thinking about as well. So if that could be part of this conversation, so that there's like kind of a one door and a step-by-step process that simplifies it for the neighborhoods and the corridor improvement districts, that would be awesome.
Yeah. So the process we followed is first figuring out exactly what we can do and getting consensus on that. And then once we know that, then of course we'll have a very clear and transparent process for getting it done.
Okay.
If people want to do it. So good point.
Thanks. That's an excellent point. I think it is confusing.
Yeah.
All right, anything else? Okay, commissioners, we're going to move on. And